The United States and Iran actually collaborated quite closely right after the September 11th attacks. And the Iranians were then quite shocked when, as a reward, they got put in the axis of evil with Saddam and North Korea, which was quite shocking to them. And I was quite horrified to read the interview in Vanity Fair like a year ago with the guy that wrote that speech. And when he was asked, how did Iran ever get stuck into an axis with such horrific dictatorships like Saddam's Iraq and North Korea? And he said, well, it wasn't in there at the beginning, but somebody pointed out that it takes 3 to make an axis. 2 isn't enough. So we had to throw in another country. He figured, oh, well, let's put Iran in there. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. Iran is eager to keep Russian influence out of the Middle East. This is a stated goal of U.S. policy. Iran's oil industry is in a state of complete collapse and disrepair. There hasn't been any real work done on the oil infrastructure for 30 years. American infrastructure and oil companies are ideally placed to do that work. There are so many ways in which Iranian interests and American interests overlap. Actually, when you think about what the U.S. wants to achieve in the Middle East, none of our major goals can be achieved without Iran. Okay, we would like to have a settlement of the Israel-Palestine question. Now, Iran cannot produce this with a magic wand, but Iran has a considerable ability to influence that and promote that if it wants to. We would like to see a nuclear-free Middle East. We would like to see a stable, democratic Iraq. None of this is achievable without Iran. Iran is what politicians call a spoiler, which means that if they're not in on the deal, they can break it up. It won't materialize. As the U.S. looks for its own interests, it needs to find ways to collaborate with Iran. We have more in common with Iran than with many of our so-called allies. So if this is true, why are we not cooperating with Iran? Why have we been so hostile to Iran for 30 years? I think it's because we're still caught up in emotion. Emotion is the #1 enemy of sound statecraft. You have to leave your emotions outside when you are dealing with diplomacy. We're still mad at the Iranians because they overthrew our Shah, then they took our diplomats hostage, and they have been waging quite an intense and sometimes violent campaign against American interests all over the world, and we haven't been able to hit them back. So we're angry at them. But anger is not a sound basis for foreign policy. We need to get past that, and we need to think about interests. We need to think about what's realistically in our own benefit. Then I think we see the value of a partnership with Iran. And I want to close by talking a little bit about this question of interests. You know, I used to live in Turkey. In Turkey, every spring, the Turkish army would invade northern Iraq to go chase the Kurdish guerrillas that were hiding in the mountains there. They would bomb them from planes, and they would send ground troops in to try to clear out these guerrilla hideouts. Now, you're not supposed to be sending your troops into other countries. And when the Turks were asked, why are you doing this, including being asked this by their own people, their answer was, because it's in Turkey's interest. We're Turkey. Nobody's going to do what's in Turkey's interest except us. So that's what we do. And I think the Turks are fine with that. Turkey does what's good for Turkey. I recently completed a project in Africa, and like many people that go to work in Africa, I became quite shocked and horrified by the role that France has played in Africa over the decades. It's horrible. And when you ask the French, now, why did you do all those things? Why do you behave this way? Their answer is very simple. C'est pour la France. It's good for us. Who's going to be doing things that are good for France if France doesn't do them? And French people are fine with that. Only Americans do not like this idea that we act in our interest. There's something childish about us that makes us feel like other countries would do such a cynical, base thing as to be Machiavellian in defense of their own interests. How selfish! We are not like that. We not only would shrink from doing something so base as just pursuing what's good for us, but We sacrifice ourselves to help other people. We even surrender our interests to help other people. We need to get real. We do things that are in our interest, and this is fine. We should accept this. We should embrace our inner realist. We should not pretend that we know what's best for the world and that we're always acting on behalf of human rights and NATO and the UN and world peace. Nobody does that, including the United States. We like to think that our interventions in the world are good for everybody, and that what's good for the US is good for the whole world. But nobody else believes that. Let us accept the fact that it's good for countries to act in their own interests, including the United States. So let's leave emotion out of it, and let's think carefully about what's really in our interest. That is the corollary. It's okay for countries to act in their own interest, but you must think clearly about what really is in your interest over the long run, and not take steps that seem like they're achieving your goals in the short run, but in the long run wind up undermining your own national security. This has been the sad history of American security policy over much of the last century, and certainly the last half century. We've taken actions in the world that made us feel good, and that seemed successful at the time, but that later have wound up corroding our own security. So this would, I think, be the kind of big idea that I would like to see the Obama administration embrace. Let's think clearly about what are America's interests over the long term. What's the world that we want to see, and how do we want to get there? I would say one piece of that would be to think what we would like in the long run would be to build a partnership with Turkey and Iran. Now, how do we get from here to there? It's not going to be so easy. You can't just call up President Ahmadinejad and say, hey, guess what? We've chosen you as our next dance partner. You have to figure out a strategy for getting from here to there. But before you get to that point, you have to know what the there is. The world only changes as a result of big ideas. You figure out what the goals should be. Where do you want to get to? Then you can work on the minutia of how you get there. But we have been so bogged down in the minutia that we've lost sight of where we want to get to. This is what I think is at the core of the kind of drift that you see in American foreign policy. We don't have a coherent long-term idea of where we want to go. I've suggested one idea here, and I'm perfectly willing to accept other people's views that this might not be the right way for the U.S. to go in the Middle East, or we should be taking another approach. That doesn't bother me. I'm not here to insist that the only way the U.S. can get out of its conundrum in the Middle East is that we got to make friends with Turkey and Iran. I happen to believe that, but other people may believe different things. What I do insist on is that we need to break out of this very, very narrow paradigm where we're still going on the assumptions that we used for the last 50 years. We're in a new era now. We haven't begun the new thinking that we need to shape our future, understanding that we're in a new era, we're in a period of uncertainty, we're going somewhere, we don't know where we're going. And that's why we haven't been able to figure out how to get there. Thank you. Great.
Well, I think that was not only a presentation, but a provocation. So we want to have at him with questions, discussion, comments.
They say the last shall be first, but I guess the first shall be first in this case. Go ahead.
You said that Iran has a lot of influence over the Middle East.
Yes.
Do you think that would be its government influence or influence from the Ayatollah?
So the question was, if Iran has influence over the Middle East, is that through the government or is that through the Ayatollahs? First, let me say that I think sometimes too much emphasis is given to the Sunni-Shiite split because of the leaders of the Gulf states being so worried about Iran replacing them as America's favorite. I think they play up this idea that no Sunni would ever want to take any guidance from any Shiite. I don't think that's really true, and I think certainly Iran's support for Hezbollah during that last war in Lebanon greatly increased Iran's stature. But I actually believe that Iran's long-term influence over the Middle East will come not from the Ayatollahs or from this current government.